The transport ship cut through the Atlantic fog like a blade through silk, its hull groaning with the weight of 217 souls who had forgotten what horizon looked like without barbed wire framing it. Greta Hoffman stood at the portside railing, her calloused fingers gripping the cold metal so tightly her knuckles had gone white an hour ago. She was 42 years old, though the mirror, when she'd last seen one 3 years prior, had shown her a woman of 60. The gray in her cropped hair had earned itself honestly, strand by strand, through nights when the sirens wailed and mornings when the count came up short. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Beside her, Anneliese Werner hummed something that might have once been Brahms, though the melody had been worn smooth by repetition, like a stone in a riverbed. Anneliese was younger, 28, with eyes that had seen too much and hands that trembled when they weren't occupied. She'd been a music teacher in Dresden before the war, before the accusations, before the camp. Now she hummed to fill the silence that terrified her more than any guard's shout ever had. "Do you think it's real?" Anneliese whispered, her breath forming small clouds in the November air. "The letter said we could walk anywhere, that we could enter shops. Greta, they said we could order coffee in a cafe and no one would stop us." Greta didn't answer immediately. She'd learned not to trust words on paper, not after the documents that had promised resettlement and work opportunities had delivered them instead to Ravensbrück. The letter from the American authorities had arrived at the displaced persons camp in Bremen 6 weeks ago, typed on official stationery that crinkled like hope and felt just as fragile. It spoke of a cultural exchange program, of reconciliation, of showing German political prisoners that democracy wasn't just propaganda. 20 women had been selected from the camp, 20 out of thousands, chosen because they'd been imprisoned by their own government, because they'd resisted, because their stories might serve some purpose in the strange algebra of post-war politics. "I think," Greta said finally, measuring each word, "that Americans love their experiments, and we're the rats in this particular maze." "But rats that get cheese," Anneliese said, and there was something desperate in her attempted optimism that made Greta's chest ache. Behind them, Sister Margarethe Vogel knelt on the damp deck, her rosary beads clicking through her fingers with the practiced rhythm of years. She'd been a Catholic nun who'd sheltered Jews in her convent's basement, a crime that had earned her 4 years behind concrete walls and a permanent limp from an interrogation that had ended with stairs and gravity. She prayed in Latin, the ancient words of fortress she'd built around the softer parts of herself that had nearly broken. The other 17 women scattered across the deck represented a catalog of resistance. Journalists who'd printed the wrong truths, teachers who'd taught the wrong history, wives who'd hidden the wrong neighbors, daughters who'd loved the wrong people. Each carried their story like invisible luggage, heavier than the single battered suitcase they'd been allowed to bring. Frieda Schultz, barely 21, stood at the bow with her face turned toward the horizon where New York City was supposed to materialize like a mirage. She'd been 16 when they'd taken her, caught distributing leaflets that called the Führer a madman. She'd spent 4 years learning that survival meant making yourself small, invisible, forgettable. The idea of walking freely through streets, of being seen without consequence, felt like relearning a language she'd once been fluent in. Ursula Beck, a doctor who'd been imprisoned for refusing to participate in the euthanasia program, stood with her medical bag, a gift from the American Red Cross, clutched to her chest like a talisman. Her hands, which had once performed surgery with precision, now shook from malnutrition damage that would never fully heal. She'd agreed to this journey because the alternative was staying in the DP camp, waiting for a future that felt as distant as the stars. As the fog began to lift, the Statue of Liberty emerged like something from a fever dream. Green copper oxidized by salt and time, the torch held high above the harbor's gray waters. Greta had seen photographs, of course, in textbooks from before, when the world had seemed larger and more forgiving. But the reality of it, the sheer improbable scale of welcome it represented, made something crack in her chest that she'd thought had calcified beyond feeling. "Mein Gott," Anneliese breathed. "It's real." The other women had gathered now, drawn by the sight, their faces a collection of wonder and disbelief and something harder to name. Frieda was crying silently, tears tracking down her hollow cheeks. Sister Margarethe had stopped praying, her fingers frozen on a bead, her mouth slightly open. Even Ursula had lowered her medical bag, her trembling hands pressed flat against the railing. The American escort officer, Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, approached them with careful steps, her uniform pressed crisp despite the ocean voyage. She was tall, blonde, with the kind of healthy vitality that came from never having been truly hungry. She'd been assigned to this detail with a briefing that had included words like sensitive and diplomatic importance and potential publicity opportunity. But standing here, watching these women encounter their first taste of the symbol they'd been promised, she felt the weight of her country's representation settle on her shoulders like snow. "Ladies," she said in careful, practiced German, "we'll be docking in approximately 45 minutes. I want to review the program once more before we disembark." The women turned toward her with the synchronized obedience of people who'd learned that ignoring authority's voice carried consequences. But there was something new in their eyes now, something the statue had kindled, a dangerous, fragile thing called possibility. Lieutenant Morrison pulled out a folder, though she'd memorized the contents. "You'll be staying at the St. George Hotel in Brooklyn Heights. Each of you will have your own room with a private bathroom. You'll receive a daily stipend of $5 for personal expenses. Your meals will be provided, but you're free to dine wherever you choose. There will be guided tours of the city, the Empire State Building, Times Square, Central Park, but attendance is optional. You may go anywhere you wish within the 5 boroughs. You are not prisoners here. You are guests." The last sentence hung in the salt air like a bell that had been rung but whose sound no one quite trusted. Greta felt Anneliese's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining with the desperate grip of drowning people who'd found driftwood. "We can go anywhere?" Frida asked, her voice small and young despite everything that had tried to age it. "Alone. Anywhere," Lieutenant Morrison confirmed. "There will be no guards, no curfews, no roll calls. You'll each be given a map of the city and our contact information in case of emergency. But otherwise, your time is your own." Ursula made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "And when the experiment is over, when we've been sufficiently observed, what then?" Lieutenant Morrison's expression shifted, something genuine breaking through her diplomatic veneer. "Then we help you find permanent placement, sponsors for immigration if you wish to stay in America, or assistance returning to Germany, to whatever home you can rebuild. This isn't a trick, Dr. Beck. My government believes that people who've suffered under totalitarianism deserve to see what freedom actually looks like." "Freedom," Sister Margarethe murmured, her voice rusty from disuse. "A word we've forgotten the taste of." The Manhattan skyline began to emerge from the morning haze. A forest of vertical ambition, glass and steel reaching toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue after years of looking up at nothing but barbed wire and searchlight. The buildings were taller than anything Greta had imagined, each one a monument to the kind of confidence that came from never having been bombed, never having seen your cities reduced to rubble and dust. As the ship maneuvered toward the dock, the sounds of the city reached them, car horns and construction and voices calling in a dozen languages. A symphony of chaos that felt overwhelming and intoxicating in equal measure. The smell hit them next. Exhaust and hot dogs and something yeasty from a nearby bakery, so different from the smell of camp. Unwashed bodies and fear and the sweet sick scent of death that had permeated everything. The gangplank was lowered with a clang of metal on metal, and Lieutenant Morrison gestured toward it with a smile that was trying very hard to be reassuring. "Welcome to New York City, ladies. Welcome to America." One by one, they descended, their feet touching American soil for the first time. Each step felt surreal, like walking on the surface of the moon. The dock was busy with longshoremen and officials and photographers. American newspapers had gotten wind of the story, saw its propaganda value, its human interest angle. Flashbulbs popped like small explosions, making several of the women flinch instinctively. But Greta kept walking, her eyes fixed on the city beyond the docks, this impossible place where they said you could be free. She didn't believe in miracles anymore. The camps had beaten that out of her. But she was willing to believe in the concrete reality of what her eyes could see and her feet could touch. And for this moment, that was enough. The St. George Hotel rose 16 stories above Brooklyn Heights, its brick facade promising a kind of permanence that felt alien to women who'd spent years in structures designed for temporary horror. The lobby gleamed with polished marble and brass fixtures, a chandelier hanging from the ceiling like captured stars. Greta stood frozen in the doorway, her single suitcase feeling absurdly inadequate against the opulence, her worn shoes leaving faint marks on the pristine floor. The desk clerk, a young man with brilliantined hair and a bow tie, smiled at them with the professional warmth of someone paid to welcome strangers. "Good afternoon, ladies. We have your rooms prepared. If you'll just sign the register, we'll have your luggage taken up." Anneliese stepped forward first, her hand shaking as she picked up the pen. She'd once had beautiful penmanship, had written musical annotations with flowing precision. Now her signature looked like the work of a different person, jagged and uncertain. Watching her own hand betray her made tears sting her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. Crying was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford for years. She wasn't sure she remembered how to stop once she started. Their rooms were on the 8th floor, arranged in a cluster so they wouldn't feel isolated. Greta's room was number 817, a number she repeated to herself like a prayer, as if memorizing it could make this real. Lieutenant Morrison handed her a brass key, its weight solid and promising in her palm. "There's a telephone in each room," Morrison explained, gesturing down the carpeted hallway. "You can call the front desk if you need anything. Towels, soap, extra blankets, all complimentary. Dinner is being served in the hotel restaurant at 7, but again, you're free to eat wherever you'd like. There's a deli 2 blocks south that's supposed to be excellent." The word "free" kept appearing in Morrison's sentences like a foreign currency they were still learning to spend. Greta unlocked her door and stepped into a space that seemed designed for a different species of human, one who deserved privacy, comfort, and the small dignities of a locked door they controlled. The room contained a double bed with a thick quilt, a writing desk beneath a window overlooking the city, a private bathroom with running hot water, and a radiator that was already warming the space to a temperature she could choose. She set her suitcase down and simply stood there, overwhelmed by the task of existing in a place not designed to diminish her. The bathroom was what finally broke her. She turned on the tap and watched hot water, unlimited, clean, hot water, cascade into the porcelain basin. For 4 years, water had been scarce, cold, rationed. You washed in communal troughs under the gaze of guards. Your nakedness just another thing that didn't belong to you. She filled her hands with water and splashed her face, then did it again and again until she was weeping into the sink, great heaving sobs that echoed off the tile walls. When the crying finally subsided, she looked at herself in the mirror for the first time in months. The fluorescent light was merciless, showing her every line, every gray hair, every place where the body had consumed itself to survive. But her eyes were still hers. Still blue, still fierce beneath the exhaustion, still capable of seeing this strange new world and trying to comprehend it. A knock at the door made her jump. Old habits died hard. Unexpected sounds still triggered the animal part of her brain that had learned to associate knocking with danger. But when she opened it, she found Anneliese standing in the hallway, her face blotchy from recent tears. "I can't stay in the room alone," Anneliese whispered. "The silence is too loud. Can I sit with you? Just for a while?" Greta pulled her inside, understanding completely. They'd lived for years with the constant presence of others, hundreds of women packed into barracks, the sound of breathing and crying and praying a constant backdrop. Solitude was a skill they'd need to relearn, if they even could. They sat together on the bed, not speaking, just existing in the same space. Eventually, Anneliese said, "There's a piano in the hotel lounge. I saw it when we came in. A Steinway Grand. Will you play?" Greta asked. "I don't remember if I can. My fingers." She held up her hands, showing the permanent stiffness in several joints from frostbite that had never healed properly. "But maybe I could try. Maybe the piano would remember, even if I don't." At 6:45, most of the women gathered in the lobby, drawn together by the gravity of shared experience. Sister Margarethi had changed into a simple gray dress that somehow still looked like a habit, her crucifix visible at her throat. Frida wore a blouse that was too large for her thin frame, buttoned up to her collar like armor. Ursula carried her medical bag as if expecting casualties, unable to move through the world without the tools of her purpose. They walked together to the restaurant, a hesitant herd of women who'd forgotten how to navigate spaces designed for pleasure rather than punishment. The maitre d' seated them at a large round table near the window, presenting menus bound in leather with gold script. The choices were overwhelming: steaks and chops and fish, vegetables prepared in ways they'd never imagined, desserts that seemed decadent to the point of obscenity. "Order whatever you'd like," Lieutenant Morrison encouraged, though she'd carefully positioned herself at a nearby table, giving them space while remaining available. "The meal is covered." Greta stared at the menu until the words blurred. The last time she'd chosen her own food, Hitler had still been alive and Germany had still believed it was winning. She'd forgotten what desire felt like when it came to something as simple as dinner. Her body had been reduced to accepting whatever calories it could get. The notion of preference seemed like an impossible luxury. Anneliese ordered soup and bread, safe choices that couldn't overwhelm a stomach that had shrunk. Frida asked for chicken, her voice barely above a whisper when the waiter leaned in to hear. Ursula ordered a salad and stared at it when it arrived, the fresh lettuce and tomatoes looking almost obscene in their vitality. Sister Margarethi gave thanks before eating, her prayer longer than necessary, perhaps buying herself time before confronting the reality of the meal. The food, when it came, was abundant and beautifully prepared. But most of them could only eat small amounts before their bodies rebelled, years of starvation having rewired their digestive systems. They wrapped leftovers in napkins with the instinct of people who'd learned never to waste, unable to comprehend that there would be more tomorrow. That scarcity wasn't the default state anymore. After dinner, Anneliese stood abruptly. "I need to try," she said to no one in particular, and walked toward the lounge where the piano waited like a patient friend. The others followed, curious and hoping. The lounge was decorated in Art Deco style, with velvet chairs and dim lighting designed to encourage intimate conversation and the consumption of expensive cocktails. The Steinway gleamed black and perfect in the corner, its keys like teeth waiting to form words. Anneliese sat on the bench and placed her damaged hands on the keys. For a long moment, she did nothing, just feeling the ivory beneath her fingertips, reacquainting herself with the geography of music. Then she began to play, slowly at first, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece about longing and beauty and the persistence of hope even in darkness. Her fingers stumbled, missed notes, couldn't stretch for the chords they once reached with ease. But the music came anyway, imperfect and heartbreaking and more honest than any performance she'd given in her former life. It spoke of everything they'd lost and everything they were trying to remember about being human. Greta felt the tears return, but this time she didn't fight them. Around her, the other women wept openly, their faces wet with a grief they'd held so tightly it had become part of their bones. Even Sister Margarethi cried, her rosary beads hanging forgotten in her lap, her faith tested and proven and tested again. Hotel guests in evening wear paused in their conversations to listen. Some looked uncomfortable, embarrassed by the raw emotion on display. Others seemed moved, though they couldn't possibly understand the depth of what they were witnessing. The sound of souls remembering they were still capable of beauty. When the nocturne ended, Anneliese lifted her hands from the keys and stared at them as if they'd betrayed her by succeeding. Then she began to laugh, a sound that started brittle and became genuine. "I can still play," she said, wonder in her voice. "They didn't take that. They didn't take everything." Frida approached the piano, touching it like it might burn her. "In the camp," she said quietly, "I used to pretend I could hear music. I'd make up symphonies in my head, entire orchestras playing just for me. It was the only way I could sleep." "What did you imagine?" Anneliese asked. "Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy. I thought if I could hear it loud enough in my mind, it would become true. That joy would be possible again." "It is possible," Greta said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it yet. "Or it could be. We're here. We're alive." That's a kind of joy, isn't it? A complicated kind, Ursula added, finally setting down her medical bag. The joy of survival feels guilty, doesn't it? When so many didn't. It was Sister Margarethi who spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of her vocation and her suffering. The ones we lost would want us to live, not just survive, truly live, to eat food that tastes good, to hear music, to walk in sunshine without fear. Guilt is a prison we build for ourselves. We've already been imprisoned enough. The truth of it settled over them like a benediction. They had been given something impossible, a second chance, a doorway to a life beyond survival. Whether they could walk through it remained to be seen. The first morning of true freedom began at dawn, when Greta woke disoriented in the soft bed, her body expecting the harsh bell that had governed her existence for years. When it didn't come, she lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of the city waking, garbage trucks and early traffic and the distant wail of a siren that made her heart race until she remembered she wasn't the one being pursued. She dressed in clothes provided by the Red Cross, a simple navy dress that actually fit, stockings without runs, shoes that didn't pinch. The act of choosing what to wear felt subversive, radical. She studied her reflection and saw a woman who might pass for normal, if no one looked too closely at her eyes. The hotel breakfast room offered another overwhelming display of choice. Eggs, bacon, pancakes, fresh fruit, pastries, juice, milk, coffee. Greta took toast and jam and coffee, building her courage one safe choice at a time. Anneliese joined her, and then Frida, and gradually their table filled with women learning to be comfortable in their own skin again. Lieutenant Morrison appeared with a schedule of suggested activities. This afternoon, there's a tour of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, she announced. Tomorrow, the Empire State Building and the Museum of Modern Art. But remember, these are suggestions. You're free to explore on your own. I'd like to go to a library, Sister Margarethi said suddenly. A public library, where anyone can enter and read whatever they wish. We had those once before the book burnings. I'd like to see if they exist here. The New York Public Library on Fifth Avenue, Morrison said, pulling out a map. One of the finest in the world. I can arrange a guide. No guide, Sister Margarethi said firmly. I'd like to go alone, to get lost in the stacks and find myself again. Morrison hesitated, torn between her protective instincts and her mandate to allow freedom. Of course, I'll write down the address and the subway directions. The word subway created a ripple of anxiety. Underground trains, enclosed spaces, crowds of strangers. It touched too many trauma points. But Sister Margarethi's face showed determination that brooked no argument. She'd faced worse than a New York subway. That afternoon, while half the group boarded a bus for the statue tour, Sister Margarethi and 4 others, Greta, Anneliese, Ursula, and Frida, stood at the entrance to the Clark Street subway station. The stairs descended into the earth like a throat swallowing them. The smell of ozone and humanity rose to meet them, along with the rumble of trains somewhere below. We don't have to do this, Greta said, seeing Frida's face drain of color. Yes, we do, Frida replied, her jaw set with stubborn courage. If we let fear make our choices, we're still imprisoned, just in a bigger cell. They descended together, following Sister Margarethi's confident navigation of the map. The station was crowded with New Yorkers rushing to their destinations, none of them giving the 5 German women a second glance. The anonymity was dizzying, to be invisible by choice rather than by survival instinct, to blend into humanity rather than be marked as separate. The train arrived with a screech of brakes and a blast of warm air. The doors opened and people poured out. Then they were swept in with the crowd, finding seats in a car that smelled of perfume and newsprint and the peculiar musk of strangers in close quarters. Frida gripped Greta's hand hard enough to bruise. The train lurched into motion and Anneliese gasped, then laughed at herself. It's like a roller coaster. Do you remember those? At the fairs. They did remember, could almost taste the spun sugar and hear the carnival music from a world that seemed to belong to different people. The train carried them through the darkness under the East River, and when they emerged in Manhattan, the city opened before them like a pop-up book, Tall buildings and taxicabs and street vendors selling hot pretzels from carts. The library rose before them like a temple dedicated to knowledge, guarded by stone lions that had weathered decades of weather and indifference. Sister Margarethi climbed the steps slowly, her limp more pronounced after the walk from the subway. Inside, the main reading room stretched impossible distances, its ceiling frescoed with clouds and sky. Desks occupied by students and scholars and people who looked homeless but were allowed to sit and read in warmth and peace. "There are no guards checking papers," Ursula whispered, her voice full of wonder. "No one asking who we are or what we're doing here." A librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and sensible shoes, approached them. "May I help you find something?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Sister Margarethi answered in careful English, the language she'd studied before the war. "I would like books about America, about democracy, about how free people govern themselves." The librarian smiled. "I can help with that. Follow me." She led them to the civic section, pulling volumes about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the history of immigration, and the building of a nation from fragments. "Take your time," she said. "You can stay as long as you like. We're open until 9. They settled at a table together, opening books with the reverence of people who'd seen what happened when knowledge was controlled and limited. Greta read about checks and balances, the separation of powers, the radical notion that government should fear its people rather than the reverse. Anneliese studied the First Amendment, running her finger over words that protected speech and assembly and the press. Frida found a children's book about the Revolutionary War, illustrations showing ordinary people standing up to tyranny. Hours passed. Other patrons came and went. The librarian brought them fresh books when they finished, never asking questions, never suggesting they'd stayed long enough. As the light outside shifted from afternoon gold to evening blue, Greta felt something shift inside her chest. A tentative, fragile belief that perhaps this place, this impossible democracy, might actually function as advertised. But the test came when they left the library at dusk and found themselves in Times Square, where the neon signs blazed like bottled lightning and crowds moved in currents that threatened to pull them apart. The sensory overload was crushing. Advertisements shouting from every surface, car horns and police whistles, the smell of roasting chestnuts and exhaust. Humanity packed so densely that breathing felt like a competitive sport. Frida froze in the middle of the sidewalk, causing a ripple of irritation as people flowed around her. Her breath came in short, rapid gasps, her eyes wide with panic. Greta recognized the signs immediately. The girl was having a flashback, her mind unable to distinguish between this chaos and the chaos of camp, between noise that was mundane and noise that preceded violence. "Frida," Greta said firmly, taking both her shoulders. "Look at me. Look only at me. You're safe. This is just a city, just people. No one is coming for you." But Frida's eyes were distant, seeing ghosts. She began to shake, her body responding to threats that existed only in memory. Anneliese started to hum. That Brahms melody again, the one she'd worn smooth with repetition. The familiar sound seemed to reach Frida where words couldn't, and gradually her breathing slowed. A police officer approached, his face showing concern rather than suspicion. "Is she all right? Does she need a doctor?" Ursula stepped forward, her medical instincts overriding her fear. "She's having a panic attack. We just need a quiet space. Is there somewhere less crowded nearby?" The officer nodded and gestured to a small park a block away, then walked with them to ensure their safety. The kindness of it, the casual assumption that they deserved help, made Greta's throat tight. They sat on a bench while Frida recovered, Sister Margarethi praying quietly, Anneliese maintaining her calming hum, Ursula taking a pulse with professional competence. "I'm sorry," Frida finally whispered, mortified. "I ruined everything." "You ruined nothing," Greta said fiercely. "We're all carrying the same weight. Sometimes it shifts unexpectedly. That's not failure, that's being human." They took a cab back to Brooklyn, the expense justified by exhaustion and the need for enclosed safety. The driver was a Jewish man from the Bronx who heard their accents and asked where they were from. When Sister Margarethi explained, carefully, choosing words that wouldn't reveal too much, he turned in his seat to look at them. You were prisoners? Political prisoners. They nodded, wary of where this might lead. His eyes filled with tears. My cousins were in Auschwitz. I got the letter last year. All of them gone. But you survived. You made it here. He waved off payment when they reached the hotel. No charge. It's an honor to drive you. Welcome to America. Welcome home. That night, they gathered in Greta's room. All 20 women, some sitting on the bed, others on the floor, creating the closeness they still needed despite having private rooms. They shared their experiences from the day. The woman who'd gone to the statue and wept at Ellis Island, imagining all the immigrants who'd found refuge. The ones who'd walked through Central Park and fed squirrels from their hands, marveling at wild creatures that weren't afraid. The pair who'd gone to a department store and tried on clothes they couldn't afford, just for the joy of seeing themselves in mirrors that showed someone who might be beautiful. Tomorrow, Lieutenant Morrison said from her position by the door, there's an invitation. The mayor wants to meet you, to present you with ceremonial keys to the city. It would be good publicity for the program, but if you're not comfortable, we'll go, Greta interrupted, surprising herself. We'll go and we'll show them what survival looks like. We'll be evidence that their experiment worked, that freedom isn't wasted on people who've lived without it. The others murmured agreement, and Greta saw in their faces the same transformation happening in her own heart. The shift from mere survival to something that might, eventually, become living. City Hall stood proud in downtown Manhattan, its architectural elegance speaking to centuries of democratic tradition. The women arrived in a chartered bus, dressed in their best outfits, combinations of Red Cross donations and items they'd managed to purchase with their daily stipends. They moved as a collective, still finding safety in numbers, their heels clicking in unconscious synchronization on the marble floors. Mayor William O'Dwyer waited in his ceremonial office, a room paneled in dark wood with portraits of previous mayors watching from the walls. He was an Irish immigrant himself, a former policeman who'd climbed through politics with the combination of charm and grit that New York demanded. When the women filed in, he stood and gestured to chairs that had been arranged in a semicircle. Ladies, he said in English, which Lieutenant Morrison translated, it is my profound honor to welcome you to New York City. Your presence here represents both a recognition of your courage and America's commitment to liberty for all people who've suffered under tyranny. The speech continued, eloquent and practiced, hitting all the expected notes of democracy and freedom and the American dream. But Greta watched his eyes as he spoke and saw genuine emotion there. This wasn't just political theater for him. He'd come from poverty himself, had known what it meant to be unwanted, and their stories had touched something authentic in him. When he presented each woman with a symbolic key, brass and decorative, engraved with their names and the date, he took time to shake each hand and meet each gaze. When he reached Sister Margarethi, he paused. I understand you sheltered Jewish families, he said quietly. My wife is Jewish. She lost cousins in the camps. I want you to know that your courage has meaning here, that it's recognized and honored. Sister Margarethi's composure cracked. I didn't do enough, she whispered. I saved 12 people, but hundreds more came to the convent and I had to turn them away. I can still see their faces. You saved 12 lives, the mayor replied, his voice thick. 12 families exist because of you. That's not nothing. That's everything to those 12 people. The ceremony moved to a larger hall where local press had gathered. Photographers captured images of the women holding their keys, standing with the mayor, embodying the success story that America wanted to tell about itself. But one reporter, a woman from the New York Post named Rebecca Goldstein, saw beyond the photo opportunity to the real story. She approached Greta after the formal event ended, notebook in hand. Mrs. Hoffman, may I ask what you did before the war? I was a teacher, Greta answered in halting English. History and literature. I taught students to think critically, to question authority, to read beneath propaganda. And that got you arrested? That got me reported by a student whose father was in the SS. I spent 4 years in Ravensbrück for the crime of teaching truth. Rebecca's pen flew across the page. What's been the most shocking thing about New York? Greta considered the question carefully. Not the buildings or the food or the abundance, though those are extraordinary. The most shocking thing is that I've been here 4 days and no one has asked me for my papers. I've walked into buildings and no one stopped me. I've sat in a library all afternoon and no one told me to leave. You can't understand what that means when you've spent years being told exactly where you can stand, what you can touch, when you can breathe. Can I quote you on that? You can quote anything I say. I have nothing left to hide and nothing left to fear. The article appeared 2 days later on the front page. German political prisoners find freedom in New York. It included photographs and interviews with several women. Their stories laid bare for the city to read. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters arrived at the hotel by the hundreds, from New Yorkers wanting to welcome them, from other immigrants sharing their own stories, from survivors of the camps who'd made it to America and wanted to offer support. An elderly Jewish couple from Brighton Beach invited them for Shabbat dinner. A Catholic church in Queens offered free English lessons. The owner of a small bookshop in Greenwich Village sent a note saying any of them could come work there if they wanted employment. But it was a letter from Hannah Klein that changed everything. Hannah was 72, a widow whose family had emigrated from Berlin in 1937, barely escaping what was to come. She'd read about Sister Margarethi in the article, a nun who'd hidden Jews and wanted to meet her. The meeting was arranged at a cafe in the East Village, a small place with checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh bread. Sister Margarethi arrived nervous, uncertain what this woman wanted from her. Hannah sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a teacup as if drawing warmth from it. "Thank you for coming," Hannah said in German, her accent Berliner and instantly familiar. "I read what you did, that you hid Jewish families in your convent." "I tried," Sister Margarethi replied. "I didn't save enough." "You saved my niece, Esther Klein. She was 14 when you took her into your basement in 1943. She stayed there for 18 months, until the war ended." Sister Margarethi's face drained of color. Esther? The girl who loved poetry? Who memorized Heine even though his books were banned? "Yes," Hannah said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "She's here. In America. She married, had children. She's alive because of you." "Where is she? Can I see her?" "She's in Boston. But I called her after I read the article. She's taking the train down tomorrow. She never forgot you, sister. She never forgot that you told her she was beloved of God, even when the world said otherwise." The reunion the next day was transcendent. Esther arrived with her husband and 2 teenage children, a living testament to the continuity that had been preserved by courage. She was 40 now, a librarian with laugh lines around her eyes and gray streaking her dark hair. When she saw Sister Margarethi, she ran like a child, wrapping her arms around the woman who'd saved her life. "I prayed for you every day," Esther said between sobs. "I didn't know if you'd survived. They took you away after. I heard you'd been arrested for hiding us." "I survived," Sister Margarethi said simply. "And seeing you now, knowing you're safe and whole and living a good life, it makes everything worthwhile." The story spread through the network of survivors and refugees that webbed through New York. More people came forward with connections to the women. Someone who remembered Greta's husband, dead in 1944, she learned. Someone who'd been in Ravensbrück with Anneliese, a journalist who'd worked with Ursula before the war. Each recognition knitted them back into the fabric of humanity, reminded them they'd once had identities beyond prisoner and victim. Lieutenant Morrison arranged for some of the reunions to be documented by the State Department, recognizing the powerful testimony they provided about the effects of tyranny and the value of resistance. But she was careful to ask permission first, to ensure the women weren't being exploited for propaganda even as their stories served political purposes. The mayor's office called to say there'd been an outpouring of donations. More than $50,000 had been contributed by New Yorkers wanting to help the women establish permanent lives. An emergency fund was being created, administered by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and Catholic Charities, to provide housing assistance, job training, and settlement support. "People are good," Anneliese said one evening as they sat in Greta's room, reading through letters of welcome. "I'd forgotten that. In the camp, I forgot that most humans are decent, that cruelty is the exception rather than the rule. But we can't forget what we know either, Ursula cautioned. We've seen what happens when good people look away, when ordinary humans participate in atrocity because it's easier than resistance. That knowledge is part of us now. Then we carry both truths, Frida said with wisdom beyond her 21 years. That humans are capable of great evil and great good. And we choose, every day, which capacity we'll nurture in ourselves. On their 10th day in New York, the women were invited to speak at a high school in the Bronx. The principal, a Jewish woman named Dr. Sarah Levine, wanted her students to hear directly from people who'd resisted the Nazi regime, to understand that opposition had existed even from inside Germany. Greta stood before 300 teenagers in the school's auditorium, her hands shaking as she gripped the podium. She taught students once, had loved their questions and their potential. But that was before, when she'd been whole and hopeful and naive about the world's capacity for darkness. I was a teacher like your teachers, she began in heavily accented English, determined to speak in their language even if it was difficult. I loved my students. I wanted them to think, to question, to become good citizens. But I taught them to question the wrong things, and that made me an enemy of the state. She told them about the student who'd reported her, about the interrogation, about the years that had followed. She didn't spare the details, didn't soften the reality of what totalitarianism meant. But she also talked about the tiny acts of resistance that had sustained her. The woman who'd saved an extra potato to share, the guard who'd looked away when they whispered after lights out, the collective decision to help the weakest survive even when it cost the group. Freedom is not inevitable, she finished. It is not guaranteed. It must be defended every day, in small choices and large ones. When you see injustice, you must speak. When you witness cruelty, you must act. The cost of silence is always higher than the risk of resistance. The students were silent for a long moment, then erupted in applause that shook the rafters. Several had tears on their cheeks. Afterward, they lined up to ask questions, to shake her hand, to tell her they'd never forget what she'd said. A teenage girl, maybe 16, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, approached last. My grandparents died in the camps, she said softly. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for being here to tell us the truth. Greta pulled her into a hug, this stranger's child who carried the weight of inherited grief. We survive so we can remember for those who can't, she whispered, and so we can warn the future. Never again isn't automatic. It's a choice we make every day. 20 German women, political prisoners who survived Nazi concentration camps, arrive in New York City in 1947 through an unprecedented cultural exchange program. Over 6 transformative weeks, they must decide: stay in America and rebuild, or return to Germany to reclaim what was stolen. These final chapters follow their diverging paths. Some, like teacher Greta Hoffman and Dr. Ursula Schmidt, return to Germany to ensure the next generation learns the truth about the Nazi regime. Others, including journalist Frida Klein and pianist Anneliese, build new lives in New York, using their survival to help refugees and create art from their resistance. Through 5 years of epilogues, we witness their remarkable transformations, not just survival but purposeful living. They become educators, journalists, aid workers, and musicians, turning their trauma into tools for teaching, healing, and preventing future atrocities. The story culminates in a powerful reunion where these women, now grayer but stronger, reflect on their journey from imprisonment to freedom, from silence to stories that echo across generations. Subscribe to Stories of Resilience, where silence is never forgotten. Each episode brings you untold narratives of survival, resistance, and the stubborn human capacity to build light from darkness.